the things that happened when that occurred was, number one, a lot of planning authority elevated to the Joint Staff and to the Office of the Secretary of Defense from the military services. So after Goldwater Nichols, it took a while for this to settle in, but the Navy was, while I was in the strategy office, the Navy was less and less in charge of and less involved in, less and less enthusiastic about, and less prepared to produce a strategy. So about 10 years before I got to the Pentagon in the summer of 1988, the Navy took off like a rocket in terms of strategy. This was the period of post-Vietnam doldrums, and completely unbidden, Admiral Tom Hayward, who at the time was passing through the Pacific Fleet, the Seventh Fleet, to become the Pacific Fleet commander. He just passed away yesterday or the day before, unfortunately. He was a remarkable guy. He was apparently a Mercury astronaut number 8 or 9, something like that. So he never got into the space program. So I guess he must have decided, well, I guess I'll make the Navy, I'll make something of my Navy career. And he did. And when he was first, as a flag officer, as a relatively junior admiral, when he was first exposed to the war plans, which at the time were, in retrospect, pretty awful, he said, no, there's got to be a better way. So there were two things, major things that he was responding to. He was responding, number one, to the fact that everyone presumed that within a day at the most, any war with the Soviet Union was going to go nuclear. And therefore, it relegated conventional war planning to very much of a peripheral enterprise. The second was that essentially the way the Navy was going to be used was to, not just the Navy, but everything in the Pacific was going to swing to the Atlantic. And somehow they were going to ensure, in some way unexpressed, that everything that needed to get to Europe would get to Europe, and somehow that was going to work out. But that's not much of a strategy. And the Admiral said, no, there are better ways to do that. So he came up with, he was the progenitor of the famous 1980s maritime strategy. The point I'm trying to make is that at that time, he and his successors, and he became the Chief of Naval Operations in 1978. At that time, the Navy strategic planning enterprise was managed by a 3-star admiral. Admiral Moreau took under his wing bright young officers. He made sure they had successive strategic planning assignments. He made sure they got promoted and so on. By the time I got to the office in 1988, that same strategic planning community was being managed by a lieutenant commander. So that's an 04 versus an 09. And, you know, that reflects the kind of attention the Navy had given the maritime strategy and maritime strategic planning and so on in the ensuing years, during which there was a tremendous success of maritime planning. So Admiral Hayward started the whole notion, which doesn't exist today, of horizontal escalation. So instead of swinging to Europe, the Navy and the other services would stay in the Pacific and threaten the Soviet Far East forces, keep them in place so that they couldn't pass across through the continent and reinforce any war that broke out in Europe. It kept Japan in, and in my view, it served to bring China in on our side. This was a profound strategic planning success. Goldwater Nichols, to get back to the point, undid all of that. had something that was really working, and Goldwater Nichols said, well, let me fiddle with this, please. And now the Navy strategic planning is a mere shadow, a relic, really, of its former self. Now, just to advertise, apparently the Navy's getting ready, preparing for some sort of Foreign Affairs magazine maritime strategy article in the next couple of months. We'll see. I've lost patience and faith that it will amount to anything that will either influence things in this country or influence other countries. So that's where Goldwater Nichols fits into all this. In my view, it undid the strategic planning enterprise. In addition to that, what it said was, we're going to center operational responsibility and command and control in the regional combatant commanders. So what that meant was, whereas the chief of naval operations used to control the Navy as an aggregate whole, now the Navy is controlled by the commander in Europe, by the commander in the Mideast, by the commander in the Indo-Pacific, and so on. It's no longer controlled centrally. Well, you know, a horse with, there's an old saying, it may even be a Chinese saying. Let's say it was a Chinese saying. A horse with two owners grows thin, right? That's one of the reasons why operationally the Navy can't paint its ships. It's being run ragged. So there were decisions made back then, more than 25 years ago, that are playing out today and not to our benefit, and in fact, to our detriment.
I mean, we are now facing a much bigger and more immediate threat from the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy.
Bigger than when? What are you comparing it to?
Well, I'm comparing it to, well, really any time since the party took power, but in particular, you know, the fall of the Cold War or the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, we thought, okay, you know, we're entering this new era where we don't have these big threats. But since then, and particularly in the last 10, 15 years or so, we've seen a massive buildup of the Chinese army, the People's Liberation Army, including their Navy, right? And this should be more apparent to really anyone watching in the U.S. government, in the Navy. So, you know, are we just not reacting to this?
I would say that we've started to react. I think what's going on in Ukraine will probably put paid to the notion that there's not much going on and that we can escape having to make hard decisions. But we'll see how that plays out. But let me suggest a couple of things about what you just said. First, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, the ground forces, have not grown. In fact, they've shrunk. But more to the point, they've reformed and modernized. So that's the first thing. The second is, as I mentioned, the only examples that I can give since ancient times that even hope to match the buildup of the PLA Navy are the buildup of the Soviet Navy after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was quite extraordinary also, and our own naval buildup leading up to World War II. And in August of 1945, the U.S., you know, the number that circulates in Washington about how many ships the Navy should have, 350 or so. At the end of the Cold War, the mantra was 600 ships. In August of 1945, the U.S. Navy had 6,600 ships. It had 36 big aircraft carriers and about 150 smaller aircraft carriers.
And those had all been built in 4 years.
For the most part, yes. Some of them were started before the war and came online. Some of them were being built when the war ended. So I've served in 2 aircraft carriers. The second one was Uss Midway, which was designed as the new super carrier and it was commissioned in September 1945, just too late for the war. There were other ships in her class that were canceled on the building ways when it became obvious that the war was going to be ended. The war was going to end.
That seems so surprising to me, since now we can barely get one aircraft carrier built on time and on schedule.
Chris, we're just not trying. Every time I talk to somebody about this, they say, oh, we could never do that again. There are some amazing stories to be told about the 1930s and 40s defense buildup in the United States. There's nothing magic about it. We had the right people with the right authorities doing the right things. Unfortunately, now we don't have those people. And the workforce has been tremendously decremented. It's just, you read the paper just the way I do. It's hard to get people to come to work. And the people who do come to work don't have hard skills. Building ships is not easy, but it's doable. But it's so. In any case, I think, Matt, that the point I want to make about your comment is that this is not that different than before. In the last 100 years, we've seen this before, and we've seen this sine wave of American challenge and American power and American response. So far, we've always responded fairly well to it. Certainly World War II and the Cold War, and there was a naval buildup before World War I also. The Great White Fleet was the manifestation of that, and its worldwide cruise. So we'll see going forward whether the Navy can respond. But it wasn't too long ago, Cold War era, when we had 10 submarines building at a time.
Wow. There
are pictures, historical pictures in American shipyards, down in Pascagoula, for instance, of the building ways where you had 8 or 10 destroyers side by side, all being built at the same time in series construction. We can build shipyards if we don't have enough. We can train shipyard workers. We can do what needs to be done. We just haven't done it. And part of this is because, in my view, the Navy's voice has been muted. It's been by the Navy, in my view. So the commander of the Central Command, where the Navy spent an awful lot of time over the last 20 years, is not going to come to Washington and say, you've got to fix your shipbuilding problem. Now, the Navy, don't get me wrong, the Navy has talked about its shipbuilding problems. The trouble is it hasn't done anything about it. So another of the progenitors of the U.S. Navy maritime strategy in the 1980s, the Honorable John Lehman, the former Secretary of the Navy, whose name is intimately associated with that maritime strategy, and that's the only one that I capitalized, capital M, capital S. He wrote a book with his colleague Steve Wills just recently. It's an e-book, so you can get it. You don't even have to pay for it. I think the title of it was "Where Are the Carriers?" So they've taken on the Navy in the debate about big carriers. And they said that a smaller carrier, for instance, literally they used this example of my ship, USS Midway, a smaller carrier, about 65,000 tons, 2 hangar bays instead of 3, and instead of the larger ships that gross about 100,000 tons. That would be sufficient because you could have more of them, number one. Number two, they could be not nuclear powered. And the reason they gave for that last thing is telling. The reason is so that you could have competition among the shipbuilders. Because right now, you only have to go to one place to get aircraft carriers built. And this is not, it just literally doesn't work. It literally doesn't work because the whole competition element has been removed from these very, very important processes.